Well, hello and welcome to an Aussie Wire Deep Dive. This is where we spend a lot longer than we can in the news, where we've only got 5 to 7 minutes per guest. We're going to spend an entire hour or so, who knows how long this may actually go for, with one guest. For those that aren't familiar with me, my name's Topher Field. I am the host of the Aussie Wire News. I'm the Australian Libertarian of the Year. I'm the award-winning director of Battleground Melbourne. I'm the author of Good People Break Bad Laws. But by far my proudest achievement is that I'm the recipient of 2 criminal charges from Victoria Police because I stood up against their lockdowns during the COVID era. So that's me. My guest today is Harry Robinson from the Lotus Eaters, and this should be a lot of fun. I interviewed him recently for a segment, a story within the Aussie Wire News, and I had so much fun. I just had to have him back. I wanted to have a longer conversation with him, and today that hope has come true, and Harry Robinson joins me right now here on the Aussie Wire Deep Dives. Harry, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you very much. It's coming up to the Christmas period, I think, at the time we're recording this, so I'm looking forward to a little bit of time off and some time with the family.
Aren't we all? Aren't we all? You know, I've been doing a bit of backgrounding on you, and I've found a little bit of juicy gossip that I want to start with. I'm going to open with the controversial stuff because if there is one thing that I think of when I look at you, it's printed on your face. I go, heavy metal. Definitely a heavy metal musician. No, I've got to say, I was kind of blindsided when I read that. Tell me about the music. What do you play? What got you into it?
I've been into heavy metal ever since I was about 12 or 13 years old. Interestingly enough, my parents raised me on their music, and they weren't much into heavy metal, but they were into a lot of rock and roll. My parents loved bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, which on some of their albums, they kind of skirt that line between punk rock and folk metal. And it was through that I got into a lot of music. They were really into punk rock. And then it was in maybe 2007, 2008, I got the video game Guitar Hero 3. And there's a wide selection of songs on that particular album. But when you get to near the end of that, you get to the song One by Metallica. And that was a real game changer for me. That was a song where I listened to that and I thought, wow, this is amazing. I love the energy. I love the melody. I love the heaviness of it. So I need to get into this. And then I got into Metallica, and then through Metallica, they're an amazing gateway band to get into all sorts of stuff. And I got into lots of other types of metal since then, because metal, if you're aware of it, for the viewers, is probably one of the most varied genres out there. There's dozens of subgenres going down to the most minute details of differences that can happen between them. Are you progressive metal? Are you progressive blackened metal? Are you blackened progressive metal? There's all sorts of
It's the People's Front of Judea. You're all a bunch of splitters.
Like yeah, and because of that, I started playing guitar, and I became a lead guitarist in bands when I was a teenager in the local area of Crewe, which is a town in Cheshire, where I'm from. Had a lot of fun playing that sort of music, and then up until last year, I was in a power metal band called War. I probably shouldn't say. But I was in a power metal band who had comedy stylings, and it was really, really good. And then the management weren't happy with the job that I do outside of the band, so I had to leave, which is a shame. But I still play music. I'm looking to collaborate with some people, some even from Australia, who I'll be able to maybe get some material out with it. It's not the sort of stuff I'll be able to play live because of the distance, unless there are some people who are interested in playing music with me in the local area. But even then, venues aren't particularly happy with hosting gentlemen with the sorts of opinions that I have, because despite the fact that in the English music scene, there are a lot of really good people in the music scene from the venue to venue, I used to get recognized quite a bit from doing this job with Lotus Eaters, and it was always very positive experiences. The people who are actually in charge of organizing gigs and managing venues tend to be massive leftists and gatekeepers, and they don't like if they're putting on music from people whose opinions they disagree with.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second. I think it's a great place to start. I studied acting for a year. I did full-time screen acting school and private screen acting school in Melbourne. And I completed the year, but by the end of that year, I'd realised that I was never going to get anywhere in the industry. One, I'm not exactly God's gift to acting. I'm not one of those people who's going to change the world because I'm just that talented. I was good enough to be a solid supporting actor. I could have had a career as playing those B characters over and over again through all the different TV series and what have you. That was about the level I was at. But I realized it was a closed shop. because I'm not someone who can keep my mouth shut. By the time I was studying acting, I'd already begun being a very outspoken, independent political commentator online, and my reputation always seemed to go before me, and I was missing out on roles and finding doors firmly closed to me. And eventually my mentor, who was a very successful actress in her own right, pulled me aside one day and she said, Topher, if you want to make it in this industry, you've really got to learn how to run with the pack for a while, by which she meant shut up and fit in. And that was when I realised I had to get out. Now, you studied television and radio. Was that a career path that you wanted to go down? Was that, I mean, I'm assuming you didn't just sort of stumble into that. And also, what does that mean? Were you studying to be on camera and on mic, or was this on the business side of things or the technical side of things? What did you study?
Well, yeah, I studied television and radio at Salford University, and it was an interesting path for me to take because I've always been a big fan of films and television. Being as part of my generation, television is always a big part of your life. Growing up, my parents, gave me the keys to the house so that I could get home from school without having to get either of them. I could just let myself in, and then you sit down and you watch the television. And my dad's a big, big movie fan. So we used to sit down every Friday night and watch films together. And I got into all sorts of different things through him. And it was something I was always really interested in. Performing has always been something that I'm interested in. Obviously, I love playing live music. And my thought was I'd come out of college and done very well for the most part in the things that I was doing there. I did English literature, English language, and I did music technology. And I didn't know what to do from then. So I started a job at a call center, as a lot of people do, especially in crew. That's where everybody goes to work at the call centers, because when we had industry destroyed in the north, all of a sudden they immediately got replaced with call centers. Very interesting how that happened. It's all service jobs up there. But then I was getting, up the ranks a little bit, and then there was some business issues where the business that I was working for shifted a lot of people around, and I was making my way up the ladder. But as part of that, my name on a spreadsheet was positioned in a way that it was easier for me to be shifted back down rather than kept in the place that I was, despite the fact that I was probably the best person in the department that I was working at, which was very frustrating. And I decided, you know what? I'm still very young. I've still got a lot of time ahead of me. My parents are still very supportive of me right now. I'll go to university. And because of my interests and because of the fact that I already ran a community radio show at the local community radio station as well, which was talking about music. It was the one rock and metal show that they had there. I thought, television and radio, if I can get into that career, if I can get into that business, would be very interesting for me and would be really rewarding for me. And plus, I knew I was a decent talker. I had no real issue performing in front of people. And I also enjoyed creating things. The creative process in itself is a joy that I take much pleasure from. And so I thought, okay, this seems right for me at the time. I'll go into that. And then I go into that and I do the 3-year course. I come out of it and somehow managed to actually find my way into a job that's somewhat relevant to it, which not everybody I went to university can say the same. But a lot of the friends that I was close with, obviously they've taken different routes to me, but I'm very happy to say that they all are making very good of themselves and actually using the degree.
Yeah, it's an interesting world, the world of film and television, and of course nowadays the world of the internet. It's possible for people to chart their own path rather than needing to get through the gatekeepers of old. Before we talk a bit more about how you ended up at the Lotus Eaters and what you're doing there and why and what motivates you, and we'll get to all those things. I want to reflect on, you just mentioned the North, and this is something that seems to come up quite a lot. Now, I was just in London for the launch of the Ark. It was an amazing couple of days there, and I didn't really get outside of London. So, and that was the first time I'd been out. First time I'd been to Europe since I was 7 years old. So I really don't know England at all, myself personally. But one of the things that I've noticed in yourself and many others that I listen to, people from the North, they're a bit like vegans. They will tell you. You don't have to ask someone if they're from the North. They will find a way to tell you very, very soon within a conversation. Why is that? What's this cultural dynamic that makes you do that?
Well, interestingly, on that point, there are many who would deny that I'm from the North because Cheshire is not the most north that you can get in England. It's south of Manchester, it's south of Liverpool. So some people claim that I'm from the Midlands. I'll just say I'm from Mercia. That's where I'm from. That's the ancient kingdom that I'm from. is Mercia, a proud warrior people. But yeah, I think the reason for that is very clear to me, which is that there is a divide in the populations. London has always been the centre of England, especially the centre of southern England, and then everything around London ends up orbiting it, until you get to about Devon and Cornwall in the far west of the south of England, and they have their own distinct culture. I think it is just that because of the fact that there is a geographical divide, that there's different cultures that have popped up between that, and people who are more from the north than from the south want to differentiate themselves from that. There has been different industries that both have been involved in. The north especially was where the Industrial Revolution really started to take place back in the early 1800s, especially in Lancashire, which is where my dad's from. And there's a pride that comes with that. There's a pride of knowing your history, knowing where you come from, knowing the people that you descend from. And so the people of the north tend to be quite defensive about that and quite proud of it as well. So I think that's it. And plus, there's also distinctive behavioral characteristics that separate them as well. This is maybe a bit of a cliche, but there's always this thing where if you're in a city in the north, if you're speaking to a proper northerner, they'll be very friendly to you. You can say hello to them in the street and they'll give you a time of day. They'll give you the shirt off their back. Whereas if you're in the south and you say hello to someone in the middle of the street who's a southerner, they'll say, what are you asking me for? Why are you saying hello? What do you want from me? And I think that's because London has been such a big city for such a long time. The bigger cities, you're more anonymous, you're more separated from people, and so you do tend to be a bit more suspicious of the intentions of others, where the north, it takes pride in more closed communities where everybody knows each other and everybody's friendly to one another.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I need
might be misrepresented a little bit, but that's my perspective on it.
I can't comment one way or the other, so I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but I do need to get back to the UK and spend a bit more time a bit further north than just London. It was a pretty quick visit to when I was there earlier this year. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the COVID lockdowns, because that seems to me to have been a really significant time for you and really, if I may say, changed the direction that you were heading in and what you kind of wanted. And it's led, I believe, to you being where you are now. I don't really know. I was so wrapped up in what was going on in Victoria, which was pretty jolly intense, that I couldn't even really tell you what went on in detail in New South Wales or in Queensland here in Australia, much less what was going on in London. So for my benefit and for everyone watching who similarly probably has no idea, what was your experience in the UK? What did lockdowns mean for you? What was the sort of the duration, the severity? What were the sorts of rules that were in place?
Lockdowns for me was a series of blatant blundering incompetences by the government, who were throwing their weight in every direction with no consistency and making it very clear that they had no idea what was going on, no idea what they were doing. And so for me, it was very interesting because it was over the course of a weekend. On the Friday and Saturday, I was out at the pub having some fun with my friends. You're hearing about this strange virus that's coming from China. I wonder what's going to be happening with that. And all of a sudden on the Monday, you're locked down 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then we'll be back to normal. But for the time being, you've just got to batten down the hatches, lads. We can get through this, get that World War II blitz mentality back, because we're fighting the proper wars here. And, that affected some people more than others. Personally, for me, I didn't actually mind it that much because I can be quite an introverted and solitary person when I want to be. So I was just locked in my home with my missus for a while. I actually used the time because I knew for a fact that it would be quite damaging to me if I didn't use my time well. So I used it as an opportunity to really get back into playing my guitar a lot because I was already part of a band, but I wasn't practicing the way I used to. So I used the time to get a load of online courses, learn more music theory, spend time practicing my technique. And it was actually very beneficial for me to do that. So by the end of lockdown, I'd managed to record demos for an 8-track album, which has still never seen the light of day. They're all still demos, but it was much more productive than what I saw other people doing. And I know for a fact that quite a few of my friends found lockdowns to be very, very damaging because they didn't have that same drive. They didn't have that same energy of purpose. A lot of people did allow themselves to get fat. I got fat. I'll have to admit, I was in great shape before lockdown. Not so much when I came out of lockdown, but a lot of people took that opportunity to lose themselves in it a little bit, and not in a good way. They indulged in drinking a lot. Some of them indulged in drugs. it wasn't good for anybody. So I saw the really negative repercussions that came from that. But then in England, we had, I think it was about 3 months of lockdown. And then, which was, you were only allowed outside for 1 hour per day. You're only allowed to do this. You're only allowed to do that. Make sure that the shops are only open for very limited hours to make sure for that 1 hour you can go out and get your shopping and then go straight back home. There were even photographs from Scotland that I saw where police officers were patrolling fields in Scotland to make sure that nobody was going out and having illicit and illegal picnics with one another, because that would be absolutely deadly. You're going to die. You're going to kill grandma for doing that. So we got all of that propagandistic rhetoric thrown at every single one of us, and it wasn't a good time for most people. And then it came to about August, and lockdowns eased up, and we had this program called Eat Out to Help Out, which was August through September of 2020, where Rishi Sunak, who was then just a minister, now he's the prime minister, but he was part of the cabinet. He had this great idea that, well, all of these businesses are really struggling. A lot of independent businesses are closing down, and the restaurants in particular are getting no business from this. They're just sitting dormant, still having to pay their rent. So go to your local restaurant. We're going to ease up the lockdowns, pay for a meal there, sit down, enjoy some social company, and you'll have fun. And I thought to myself, but all the messaging that we were just told was that there's still no vaccine. There's still nothing that we can do to prevent getting this other than keep very separate from one another and wear the masks. And all of a sudden we're getting told that actually it's perfectly fine to go out and have a meal in a very public venue. So for a lot of people, that was a clear contradiction. And then as it goes on, it comes to a Christmas and we have to lock down again. And then the government turns around and says, actually, you were all very wrong for going and eating out to help out. That didn't help out at all, it turned out, according to the government. And then all it took was really looking at when you start to hear people say, oh, this isn't as big a deal as they're saying it is. This is nowhere near as deadly as they want you to believe it is. And all it takes is looking at the NHS website statistics, which you can find through the documents that they hold there, for the rates of infection, for the rates of how deadly it was, who was actually dying from this, if you want to believe that they were dying directly from it and not just with COVID, as it turned out was the case later on. And it became very clear that these numbers were very inflated. It became very clear that the only people who were truly at risk from this were age 60 and above. Sometimes even it was mainly 70 or 80 and above. So that was a big epiphany and awakening for me. And then the other thing that lockdowns allowed me to do was it allowed me time to read books. And I began by getting into, as I think happened with many people, the first stepping stone was getting into Jordan Peterson.
Oh, yeah.
And from him, I read, because I was in a bad place because I had exhausted all of my energy by the end of the first year of lockdown at the end of 2020 and was beginning to feel myself slipping into the same hole that I knew a lot of my friends had slipped into. Yeah. And so I'd seen some clips of this guy circulating on Facebook and on Instagram. So I thought, he's got a book, 12 Rules for Life, which is supposedly a self-help book. So I'll read a bit of that. So I read that and I took some of the advice from it and I thought it was very useful. But I also noted throughout, he kept referring, you know what Jordan Peterson's like, he kept bloody going on about this book by some Russian guy called Solzhenitsyn called The Gulag Archipelago.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, that sounds really interesting. I'll get a copy of that. And I got a copy of that and read it, and it was very eye-opening, and it was part of my political awakening. And then throughout that, I started to take these extra steps where you start to read other things, you start to develop more of a personal worldview. Because before that, I'm not saying that I was an NPC or anything, but it was very much that I had my own opinions on things. I had run-ins with people in the past who you could classify as SJWs, and I didn't agree with them, and I thought that they were very coarse people. I thought that they were very rude. They had no time to hear anybody else's opinions. But this was really when I began to make connections in politics and started to get really interested in politics. And it was from that point as well that I began watching Lotus Eaters.
Sure. So it's one thing to have an awakening. It's one thing for you to go through this journey on your own. It's another layer again to then say, and I'm going to talk about it. And I'm going to put myself out there and actually, really, because at that point you really are going to lose some friends in inverted commas. It is going to impact your everyday life. For all you might have known, it might have impacted some of your close relationships as well. So talk me through the journey, and obviously, applying for a job at the Lotus Eaters, etc. That's all sort of part of it. But there's also that internal journey of you going, I'm reading these things, I'm coming to these conclusions, I'm starting to believe in these things, and now I want to talk about them publicly and sort of champion these things? What was that process for you?
Well, for me, the process was quite scary at first, if I'm being perfectly honest, mainly because of the fact that running in the circles that I did, I knew for a fact that given that I was reading these things and they were changing my opinions, that, or at least helping me to get a more coherent and informed understanding of the world, I think is probably a better way of putting that, that it would affect my personal relationships with some people, and that some people that I knew were more open-minded and more able to and willing to talk with people about opinions that they didn't agree with, and have an open discussion with it. And there were some people I knew who were very closed-minded about that, and I knew it would really affect those people to know this. But it was quite scary at first to know that, and to have to admit to myself that this is what I want to do. I suppose for me, I was working a job at the time where it was another media-related job, but it was about subjects that I'm nowhere near as interested in. It was something that I'd taken immediately after university because it was somewhat relevant to the degree that I did, and I was able to earn some money from it. But it became very mundane, very tiring, very repetitive as well. It was a series of writing the same few articles over and over and over again, just so that you could try and sell a product to some people. There wasn't very much variation in it. And I'd begun watching the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about this sort of stuff? Because I've always had quite a loud mouth. As much as I can be quite introverted and really like to keep to myself, generally I've always been one for getting into a bit of an argument and a bit of a debate as well. I got into quite a few heated discussions back in secondary school, back in college, back in university as well. Some of the lecturers at my university absolutely despised me because of the fact that, one, I already knew half of the information that they were telling me anyway, because I when you work at a call center and you don't have much to do that day and there's not many calls coming in, you get really bored. So I'm quite an inquisitive person, and I just started to read things online and about media because I was already interested. So they hated me for that, because I also disagreed with them on quite a few things. But I thought, it would be really interesting to do that. And then one day, I think it was in the August of 2021, I looked on the website and saw that there was a job going. So I just threw my hat in there. I sent an email and thought, nothing's going to come of this, but at least I might as well give it a try, say that I've tried. And then it all led to this. So yeah, it was quite an interesting experience for me. And I made my friends aware of it at the time. I made my bandmates aware of it at the time, and they were all very supportive at the time. I think most of them weren't paying attention to what kind of business that I was joining and the sort of opinions that I had. Because, like I say, running in the sort of circles that I do, the consensus leans heavily left. There are quite a few people I knew who were fans of people like Nigel Farage, but they were considered strange. They were considered outliers. They were considered the people that, oh yeah, he's a really good lad, but don't talk to him about these subjects. Whereas my job now was going out and explicitly shouting about these subjects to an audience of tens and if not hundreds of thousands.
Can I say, though, it feels as though this is a relatively recent invention. I mean, I'm 41 years old. You're quite a lot younger than I am. So I'd love to get your thoughts on it from your perspective. But from my perspective, I feel like in the 1990s and in the 2000s, you could have these kinds of really fundamental differences with people and still, like you say, he's a good lad, but just don't talk to him about that. Like that served us well right up until about, 2016 or 17. And then the world started to go weird. And then I feel like it just got turned up to 11 during COVID. There was something about that period where we were all glued to our screens watching, political leaders telling us to be afraid. And the world was kind of really divided into two camps in terms of, are you for the lockdowns, etc., or are you trying to kill grandma? And I feel like that polarization then infected every other area of life. Do you think it would have been that divisive, let's say 2017, 2018, for you to come onto something like the Lotus Eaters?
It still would have been divisive with some of my friends, because some of my friends are really hardcore, I should say, hardcore leftist anarchist types, the kinds who were made sure that you knew that they were as punk as humanly possible. But among most of my friends, it probably wouldn't have been that much of an issue. And I say all of this, most of my friends are still my friends.
Yeah.
It has affected a few of my relationships, But most of the people that I spend time with, I like to think I have a good relationship with them and have a good eye for people who I can rely on. So I'm still friends with most of them. But you are right that there has been a massive paradigm shift around that time in 2014 through 2016. And I think the big thing that caused it was Trump. I think even in the UK, it was a big talking point over here. And the other thing was probably Brexit in the UK. So for some reason, and this is a result of globalized politics, easier access to information from across the globe because of the internet and mass media, mainstream media, is that you're able to become much more invested in foreign politics. I mean, I talk a lot about foreign politics, so I'm not going to say it's a terrible thing. But in England, all of a sudden, it became very strange to me in my first year of university that everybody knows Trump. Everybody is aware of Trump. Everybody has an opinion on Trump, despite the fact that he's thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
But that's because the mainstream media had hammered it into everybody's head that he is the devil incarnate. Even if you're in England, even if there's an ocean separating you, he is the devil incarnate. And we saw that reflect in how there were, whenever Trump would come and visit England as part of his presidency, he would often receive protests against him.
Yeah.
He would be snubbed by politicians in high ranks. So that was very interesting. And Brexit was the big one over here. That was the big dividing line. Did you want to remain in the European Union, or did you want to leave? Why did you want to leave? If you did want to leave, was it just because you're a racist that you want to leave?
Yeah.
And I think it's an effect of the fact that most people, and I don't want to big myself up through this, but I think a lot of people on the ground don't take the time to truly read into these subjects, and they don't take the time to formulate their opinions. I think a lot of people get their opinions fed to them by the mainstream media, and even worse, in a lot of cases, by films and television. And I say that as a big fan of films and television, but that's the fact of the matter, is that a lot of people get their understanding of the world from the media that they consume, because you're passively consuming something. It means it has a great deal of opportunity to influence you, whether you realize it or not. And because of that, a lot of people were fed this vile, hate-spewing rhetoric that if your grandma at the dinner table says that actually she thinks that Britain should have more control over her borders and so forth, so therefore is going to be voting in favor of Brexit, that we should leave, then she's just one step away from donning an SS uniform, and she's going to be administering the Gestapo as we go out and we sterilize ethnic minorities and round them up into camps. And I think that was one of the big dividing lines for a lot of people. And for the people who bought into that rhetoric, it's not too difficult for them to begin accepting the rest of the intersectional progressive message. Well, if they're right about this, if grandma really is a secret Nazi in disguise, well, it is probably better that I be as tolerant as possible. It's better that I be accepting of all of these absurd ideas about reality and how it works. It's better that I take all of this on board, because if I don't, then I'm a Nazi too. That seems to be one of the thought processes that's influenced most people.
There's an overcorrection. We see that in reverse racism. I want to get to talking about a lot of those things with you in just a minute, but I've got one last thing I want to ask you about that's historical about your story and your journey. Your very first tester that you did for the Lotus Eaters was actually on the topic of the Melbourne lockdowns and the Victorian lockdowns here in Australia and our experience under COVID. Why was that what you picked? What was it about what you saw all the way from the other side of the world that made you go, you know what, I want to talk about this, and this is of all the topics you could have talked about, that's the one I'm going to do my test on?
Well, the thing about that was that what we were seeing coming over from Australia and New Zealand, both of those countries in particular, was a very extreme case of what we could see have happening over here. Thankfully, I think our leaders in the UK, while insane buffoons, have spines made of jelly. They don't have the willpower to be quite as overtly authoritarian as the leaders in somewhere like Australia or even in New Zealand, which you wouldn't expect it of someone who looks like Jacinda Ardern, but she was, very bad in that period. And so it was interesting to me to see, and horrifying to a certain extent, to see the way that people were being treated over simply wanting to go outside, over their decision of whether or not to take the vaccine, families having their daughters ripped from their arms so that they could be forcibly injected with a vaccine that we were very uncertain of at the time. It all came across as quite dystopic to me. And so that's one of the things that inspired me to talk about that.
Was that also part of what contributed to that being such a revolutionary time in your own mind and your own thinking? Was seeing what was happening over here feeding that journey for you?
Yes, certainly. When you can see the lengths at which power, that being the political power, those in charge, will go to rip your own decisions away from you and to be able to force negative decisions on you, just seeing how far in the modern age they can go, has made me very skeptical of the decisions of all of our leaders from that point onwards, because we're fed this narrative in the current day where it's the modern day, it's the modern year, it's the current year. Things don't happen like they used to in the past. We're past that. We're more enlightened. We're progressive. We have these intersectional values. They're all good for you, and you need to accept them blindly. And also, we only have the best of intentions for you. Whereas the leaders who are in charge at the moment, very clearly, as far as I could tell, did not have our best intentions in mind. They had what keeps them in power in mind, and they had what makes us easy to control in mind. And if that meant scaring everybody or enacting just a police state on people to be able to keep those under control, that was what they were going to do. Once again, apparently, the story we're told is that that doesn't happen anymore, but very clearly it was. So that dissonance, that disconnect between the narrative and the reality was one of the things that made me very, very skeptical.
I want to switch gears and look forward a little bit and get your thoughts on what's happening, particularly in the UK, but also we're going to talk a bit more widely worldwide in just a moment. One of the things that happened around the Brexit debate was we were certainly being told, even all the way over here in Australia, that Brexit was going to be a disaster for young UK people. It was going to cut you off from the world. You'd be growing up in a collapsed, failed state that England would not be able to survive if it actually voted yes to Brexit. Now, of course, Brexit happened. It happened very imperfectly. The whole process was a bit of a mess. And to be honest, I kind of stopped paying attention a few years in. I kind of went, you know what, you guys can just have your own problems. We've got enough of our own over here. From your point of view, you've grown up in what I was told, or not grown up in, but you've come into adulthood and into working and into this phase of your life in what I was told was going to be a dystopian nightmare where you weren't going to be able to find work. What's the reality of life over there in the UK for yourself, your colleagues, the people you've gone to uni with, etc.?
Well, it depends on exactly where you are in England because it's affected different places in different ways. I wouldn't say that the narrative that you were told about England being a failed state was correct in the way that those pushing that narrative would have wanted. But I would say that overall, Brexit has not been what it was sold to people. Sure. When Brexit was finally pushed through by Boris Johnson in late 2019, we were told, and this is the reason that he got such a massive majority in that election at late 2019, was that he was going to get Brexit done. We were finally going to take control of our borders. This would be good for everybody. They're going to have the biggest majority ever. So therefore, all of those terrible things that Labour did back during the Blair and later Brown years could be reversed. We can get rid of them. We can repeal that legislation and make Britain great again. Essentially, was the message that we were being told. Yeah. Especially given that Boris Johnson was being represented as a kind of a counterpoint, a mirror image of Trump in some ways. So that was very much the message that we were being told. But what actually happened since then was that we got lockdowns. Boris Johnson's government was the government that did lockdowns, and then Boris Johnson's government was the one that had all those scandals. Matt Hancock coming out and turning out to have been flaunting his own lockdown rules. Boris Johnson holding holding dinner parties where nobody was sticking to all of the social distancing. That was a clownish moment. But one of the major things that happened as a result of Brexit was that instead of being able to control the borders, like what you were saying, that you were told that it would end up with Britain being cut off from the rest of the world. If anything, it's led to us inviting more of the rest of the world in.
Yeah, right.
Prior to Brexit, the main immigration that we were receiving into the country was that of EU migration. And it was still in far too large numbers. It was still unsustainable. But EU countries being European, are closer in the culture, closer in the behavioral standards to the people who already lived in Britain, closer to British people. We've got shared history a lot of the time. Obviously, we've had many wars against one another. We've had many alliances against one another.
Might not be friendly history, but it's history.
Yeah. But we were getting mainly people from Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe. And I know quite a few people because a lot of them went to Stoke and in the Cheshire area and Crewe. I know a lot of Polish people. I know a lot of Eastern European people, and they're all very kind people. They're all good people, and they tried to assimilate in and to get jobs and do things. But post Boris Johnson, they tried to lessen the EU migration coming in and exploded the non-EU migration coming in. Okay. So we already had a sizable population of Pakistanis and Muslims. That's exploded. One of the main figures that's exploded was parts of Africa, North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We've had massive increases in those numbers coming in. So what it's meant is that I think prior to Brexit, or Boris Johnson implementing Brexit, we were getting probably an average of about 200,000 people a year on net average. Whereas now, the recent figures that have been revised for June of 2022, I think it was about 745,000.
Yeah, wow.
Now, a lot of those will be visas that have been accepted for education. So that'll be lots of Chinese students coming in and going to Oxford and Cambridge and other prestigious universities, which is interesting for me because it seems that the tactic seems to be, well, we can make a lot of money training up elites who are going to be going into the government positions in the CCP, which is a country that is our enemy in the geopolitical sense. And so that's a very interesting tactic to do that. A lot of these people will be coming over on work visas to work for the NHS. And a lot of them as well will be part of chain migration. So you get these things where somebody will come in on a particular work visa, and then he will be able to bring the rest of his family along. But there's no real end to that, because then that person comes in on a visa. You bring your wife in on a visa, and then she's got the visa. And then you say, well, I'm going to bring my dad in, and my dad comes in, and his wife comes in, and then the rest of the family comes in. So you get these massive pools of migration, and they always tend to go for the same areas as well. So you get these essentially ghettos pop up. And the interesting thing was that in 2021 census data results that we received, we were able to get a demographics map of the country where you can go and zoom into a street level to see the percentage population of one particular ethnicity and another particular ethnicity. And what you find examining that map is that the segregated divide is very clear. You'll get places like Leicester, where the entire east side is pretty much entirely white British, and the the west side is white British. The east side is Indians and Muslims and Pakistanis. So they all group together, and you get this massive divide throughout society. We're importing foreign conflicts in, like Leicester in September of last year had violence on the streets where the Hindus were confronting the Muslims, because it turns out that foreign populations don't all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. They have their own histories that they bring with them, and their own ethnic conflicts that they bring with them. So while I wouldn't say that we're entirely a failed state yet, we are making all of the moves to become a failed state, especially when you factor in things like inflation. Like inflation, I've seen means that we're all earning a lot less. I think if I get the inflation calculator up, if you've got a moment.
Yeah, sure.
The inflation calculator, Bank of England on the UK. If I see what I'm earning today, I'll accept the cookies, sorry. What I'm earning today, if I was earning it in, let's say before lockdowns, let's say 2019.
Yeah.
Let's see what that was earning and what the rate of real inflation has been. Oh, wait, actually, I put the number down wrong, show the amount. Yeah, what I'm earning today is worth about £5,000 less than what it was worth in 2019. Yeah. So that's a ridiculous rate of inflation. People aren't able to make up for that. Yeah. People are also experiencing the housing crisis because we aren't building enough houses for the amount of people that we've got coming into the country. And even if we were building enough houses for the amount of people coming into the country, England only has a limited amount of space in it. So there's all of these different problems. So I will say that I can be quite pessimistic about the future. As long as the leaders that we have in charge at the moment are in charge, there seems to be no change in the policy. The Conservatives will always come out every so often and come out with these big blazing speeches about how we're going to stop the illegal boats coming into the country. We're going to do this to cut migration. We're going to do that to cut migration. But they don't. They never do. And they'll always implement these kooky schemes that end up with more migration coming into the country. So that, for me, tends to be my biggest issue that I like to hit on at the moment is we need to get these numbers down, and we need to start taking some form of control back over our culture and our borders. But for while the Conservatives are in charge at the moment, that will never happen, and I have no trust in Labour to do anything as well, because Labour are trying to put this rhetoric forward that they're going to be the ones to control the boats, they're going to be the ones to control migration. They won't. That will not happen.
It's a concern even all the way across the opposite side of the planet. Here in Australia, watching what's happening in the UK is a real concern. And we have a lot of, obviously, cultural similarity. Our entire political system is designed based on the Westminster system. So much of our common law and so many of our laws and culture, obviously our language, have all derived directly from the UK. And England was the home of freedom. It was the home of free speech. It was the home of the Magna Carta. It was always one of the leading countries up until perhaps arguably the US War of Independence, when perhaps the US took that mantle. But certainly for so much of the formation, and you feel free to disagree with me. I saw that little wince on your face. Feel free to tell me that I'm wrong. But certainly for a millennia, England was the place that was leading the way in so many respects, along with a couple of other bright spots within Europe. And now it seems that the UK is almost leading the charge in the other direction. You've got people going to prison for Facebook posts. I mean, we're not even doing that over here to the same degree that you are over there. You've got, Tommy Robinson being dragged off the street just because he exists, just because he was there at the time when the organisers said they didn't want him. You can fill me in on the details of what exactly happened with that nonsense. You've got a situation now where it really feels as though the home of freedom is being one of the first and fastest to abandon it. Am I wrong? Can you tell me that I'm wrong, please?
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
That's the interesting thing, is that I think it comes down to the fact that we have particular people in charge who have been part of the same elite group for a very long time, who want to push particular narratives and particular ways of behaving on people, that people, as we've seen through lockdown, as we've seen through organizations like the Lotus Eaters popping up, are not happy with the way that the country is functioning. They're not happy with the way that the country is heading, and they want to speak out about that, and they want to organize politically to do that. Of course, that puts the people who are in charge at massive risk. If people start to believe different things, if people start to organize in effective ways, then that puts their positions at risk. And a lot of people, myself included, would even like to see some of these people charged with crimes, because I do believe that what was happening during lockdown was a crime. I believe the betrayal of the British people is a crime worthy of treason charges, to be perfectly honest. So these people see that their positions are always at risk. They see the idea that other people could come in charge and take the systems back and put them right the course of the ship, so to speak, as threatening to their existence. And so the more they get worried about that, the more regressive, the more oppressive they're going to be about it. Because if your position is at danger, is at risk, you're going to do whatever you can to try and keep a hold of the power that you have.
So in that context then, because I agree with you 1,000%, Klaus Schwab just came out recently, and keep in mind, obviously, for viewers, we're recording this in very late 2023. It'll get released in very early 2024. So just only a week or so ago, Klaus Schwab came out attacking directly and by name, attacking libertarians and saying, these people want to reduce the influence of government in your life. And for me, I mean, I personally identify as a libertarian. I'm not sure exactly where you stand, and nor is it necessarily relevant. But to me, that speaks to exactly the point you just made. He's now calling out what he sees as the threat to himself. And in some sense, I find that one of the most encouraging things I've seen this year is the fact that Klaus Schwab himself is now having to go on the defensive.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that the power that we have right now, these people are deathly afraid of using what you could term as being hard power. For a long time, the regimes that have been in effect in the West, as was referenced really when I was talking about how the conservatives and the elites in the UK have spines made of jelly, they're desperately afraid of using really repressive measures and being seen to visibly use violence to enforce what they're doing, which is one of the ways that they try and maintain this narrative that we're completely different from all other oppressive regimes that have existed in the past. But the more people are beginning to try and organize and trying to break themselves out of the narratives that are being fed to them by the media and by other outlets, people are starting to see that they're going to have to use these more repressive measures. And that's what Klaus Schwab is talking to there. Because I have said recently on a podcast that I believe it doesn't matter exactly who is de facto or de jure head of the government in the UK. It could be Nigel Farage, it could be anybody else. The main power lies within these gigantic bureaucracies who are the ones administering the policies that are put forward. You can have a policy paper that says, we're going to do this, but if the people who are actually working in the departments that are supposed to do that say, I'm not going to do that, then nothing gets done. There was a really interesting article in the Telegraph recently. It was a submission by an anonymous writer who said that he worked in the Home Office, talking about how all of the staff of the Home Office basically hate the public, hate that the public wants them to reduce immigration. They rubber stamp any visa that comes ahead of them, and they actively refuse whenever the head of the Home Office, who previously was Suella Braverman, when she came in and said, we need to do this, they would laugh at her and say that they were not going to do that behind her back. And she would be really apologetic for having to ask them in the first place. So I just mentioned on a podcast recently that there will not be real change made until there are at least floods and floods and floods of ex-civil servants on the streets of London queuing up for the dole. And as much as there are plenty of parts of libertarianism that I don't agree with personally. I used to be a libertarian. I don't consider myself anymore. But I do think one of the things that they do get right is that the gigantic bureaucratic surveillance states that we find ourselves living under at the moment need to be culled. They need to be made much smaller. And one of the worrying things about Labour as well in the country is at the beginning of the year or the end of last year, I forget exactly when, they released a policy paper talking about New Britain. And one of the things that that paper did was say that they were going to change the way that all of the local councils worked in the country, which was essentially going to centralize them and make sure that Labour or whoever's in the power of the government will have even tighter controls over them at the moment. Now, our government is nowhere near as decentralized as the state level governments in America are, but the local council still means that there is a certain level of independence that some of the local constituencies can administer to themselves. This would destroy that forever. And like so much else of Blairism, because Tony Blair has had a direct hand in guiding the Labour Party for the past year or so. So much of Blairism is implementing these gigantic bureaucratic changes, creating new departments and policies that mean that they can never be reversed. That's what happened with Ofcom. And then inevitably you get mission creep, where these organizations, these bureaucracies come in with one stated goal and they start to expand what that goal means until all of a sudden they're administering everything.
Well, I imagine that you, like me, are going to be watching with a great deal of interest as Javier Milei has just become the president of Argentina. We'll see how he goes. I certainly wish him luck, but I think he's going to find himself up against it, probably with a very hostile Congress there in that country. Comment on that if you'd like to, but also can I lead into, you made the comment earlier that within England and actually around the world, people are being kind of woken up, if I can use that expression. They're kind of being jarred out of that, I think, the sense of safety and sort of smug, coddled warmth. I mean, being born in Australia in the 1980s was winning the lottery. That was, it was an incredible time to be born, and we really could take it all for granted. And for a long time we did, and now we're suddenly discovering, hang on, we can't take it for granted anymore. And in fact, we should have stopped taking it for granted probably 15, 20 years ago, but we didn't. We kept taking it for granted, and now we've got some catching up to do. We see that manifesting, a lot of people waking up now. In the UK, I would argue one of the clearest manifestations of that I can see is the Blade Runner phenomenon that has kind of emerged in London City. I don't know how much you do or don't want to say about that. I don't know how sensitive that is in the UK. How do you see Blade Runners?
So for the context of anybody watching who might not be aware, the Blade Runners, if I remember, we've covered it a few times, there is a scheme going on at the moment called the 15-minute cities in the UK, where some of the local councils have decided that what they want to do is to create walkable towns within the cities where there's everything that you need. There's walkable access to educational facilities, to your jobs, to shopping facilities, to gyms, which all sounds like a really lovely idea. To be fair, being someone who likes going for walks and likes to consider himself a very local person, that's how I orient my thinking, is that I like to live in a local area where I know people and trust people, where you have a community. they're doing it in ways that are, as you would imagine, very heavy-handed and not what the people who are living in these communities want or even voted for, where they're putting up roadblocks to prevent people from being able to drive. What it is actually for, you could say it's for community cohesion, but it's actually for the sake of hitting net zero. And one of the things that they've been doing for that is these low carbon emission zones, where they'll put up cameras all over the place in towns and cities. Like we live nearby Bath in Swindon, and Bath has these cameras set in place where they'll check your registration, check your number, and see if you've paid a fee to drive into a town centre. And then you have to pay these fees if you want to be able to drive your car around there, unless it's a super low emission or electric car already. And it's basically a move to try and prevent people from driving from place to place, restricting your movement. And people have been in Oxford and other parts of and London as well, have set up the Blade Runner scheme, where it's a load of people on the ground. It's very grassroots, as far as I can tell, to go around and sabotage these cameras. But I do think that is an expression that it's becoming more and more visible, the ways in which the people in charge want to be able to control you and want to be able to restrict your movement. And people are becoming fed up of that, and they are starting to make these take these measures. They take these more extreme measures that in the UK that we don't see very often. I think it's still to be seen what comes of that, because the government can always just begin to repressively arrest these people. We saw in America after Jan 6 that certain security services can have incredibly sophisticated ways of tracking people down. There were people who were posting memes about Jan 6 right before it happened, who ended up being arrested and put in prison because of those memes in America. And those are just jokes. Those are jokes online. But as we know, in England, you can get arrested, you can get fined, you can get imprisoned for jokes as well. So going out and actually destroying government property, we'll see where that goes, because I've not heard much about the Blade Runners for a few months now, but maybe it's worth looking into again.
Look, it did go a bit quiet. I was hoping while I was in the UK for the ARC launch to be able to actually spend a bit of time doing a bit of on-the-ground journalism on that. As I mentioned in the opening, I made a documentary all about the civil disobedience and the protests and the pushback against the lockdowns here in Victoria. And I take quite a deep personal interest in civil disobedience. And for me, the Blade Runners are pushing right up against that boundary of legitimate civil disobedience where it crosses over into vandalism and into other things. And I want to get on the ground and I want to talk to these people and really, really understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Just to really, I guess, satisfy myself that this is legitimate civil disobedience and not simply a BLM-style expression of lawlessness, shall we say, where they call it a protest, but actually they're just burning down a city and looting stores and getting TVs for themselves. So if you do, let me know how you go with your own sort of looking into it. I'd be fascinated to get an update, and I'd potentially fly back to the UK for the purpose of doing some work on that specifically. I find it a really important moment, to be honest, and potentially one of the most important movements that's happening in the world right now. Although it's very difficult to say that in real time. That's usually something you can only judge in hindsight. Let's come back to Trump for a moment. He's fully expected, or at least correct me if you disagree, but it seems that he's fully expected to probably get the Republican nomination for the Republican presidential candidate in the US. At this point in time, as best as I can tell, the Democrats appear that they're going to run with Biden. As astonishing as that does kind of feel to say, that seems to be the play at the moment. How do you see all of this playing out? Do you think that fraud is such an issue over there that really it's already he's already got it? Do you think there's going to be a real election? And do you think that a Trump 2.0 could actually happen?
I think if we see anything of the likes that we saw in 2020 in the election happen again this year, that people will be very angry and it will give fuel to the fire of the opposition that the Democrats and the entire electoral system in America is facing at the moment. I do believe, as Trump has pointed out and said that he was going to try and deal with and was sadly unable to effectively deal with back in 2016, that there is a deep state within the US that has its own interests and its own aims. And I think that they know that if they do what they did in 2020 again, it will become too obvious and it might create more opposition to them. Whereas if Trump is allowed a fair election and wins, because I believe that if Trump gets a fair election in 2024, he absolutely will. Even among Democrats, they can recognize that Biden is a terrible choice, although you still get those people who vote Democrat habitually just because it's who they vote for. There is also the chance for Gavin Newsom, but I think that would be a foolish thing to do. If the Democrats ran Gavin Newsom, it'd be better to give Trump another term, let him run that term through, and then run Gavin Newsom against DeSantis, whoever the Republicans end up running in 2028. I think, as it stands, I think Trump becoming president would be the most likely option. I think that would be the most likely result. I think that would be the fair result, and I think they'll let the fair result happen, because I do think that if Trump gets in, he will be able to do only so much. As we saw last time, he wanted to clear them out. He wanted to drain the swamp. He was unable to effectively do that. Whereas if the swamp makes itself, if the deep state makes itself more and more visible over and over and over again, it will give power to people who might actually have a more effective chance. Although I say all of this sounding quite pessimistic. I hope if Trump gets in that he is able to remove some of these people. But the fact of the matter is that these people are very powerful. And this is the same for all governments. I think in Europe, a lot of what we see right now is the fact that America, since the end of World War II, because so many countries were completely indebted to America in ways that they'd never been before, just because of all of the war effort that America contributed, the weapons, the money they contributed over here. Europe is essentially a series of vassal states for American interests in Europe and the rest of the world right now. Similarly with how Israel and America have a very special relationship with one another, so that Israel and America can work together for their own interests in the Middle East. And if you get in the way of these people's interests, I think they are more than willing to JFK you. Essentially, is what I'm saying there. So I think if Trump begins to represent a true threat against the deep state's interest, the first thing I would recommend that he do is hire some incredibly competent personal security for himself, similar to Milei in Argentina as well. If he is actually going to be a threat to the government and the deep state that will exist down there, all these departments that he's shutting down, which supposedly recently, at the time of recording, I think he's signed an executive order to shut down, I think, 21 departments
all but 9
of the government there and leave 9 left. I hope that if that works, that he is able to go ahead with it and that he doesn't face the legal challenges. And I hope that if he does get to do it, that he doesn't get disappeared or have a nasty accident, because that is always the threat when you're threatening these people.
Yeah, I'm just getting in earlier and saying Javier Milei didn't kill himself. So looking around the world, we can see some really interesting things happening. I mean, there is talk, and you tell me how ridiculous this is or whether this could actually be a thing. There is talk of Nigel Farage making his way back into politics and the expectation that he might be very successful if he does. There's talk that is actually potentially the very reason why he was on the most recent series of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in the Australian Jungle, was for the purpose of trying to get airtime back in the UK and potentially build that profile and prepare for a run. We're seeing Trump go again for the presidency of the US. We've just seen Geert Wilders, a European politician, a Dutch politician, take government there in a coalition government. We've just seen New Zealand have their most conservative coalition government basically in their history. If you look at the policies, at least the policies that they're promising, we'll see what comes of that in practice. And we've just seen the first libertarian president in over 100 years elected anywhere in the world in the form of Javier Milei in Argentina. Is this a consequence of all of the COVID madness and the lockdowns? Is this the backlash, the counterculture from that? Or is this some separate, unrelated phenomenon?
I think it is the result of a lot of people becoming very frustrated and tired of living under the regime that they do. I think it's perfectly reasonable that people want change. People have seen that whatever the system is that we're living under at the moment, it doesn't work. It doesn't create the best results for people. The only people that it works for are those in power and their client groups. There is part of me that worries about it, though, mainly because I have seen firsthand how this goes, that some of this, there's a term in some of the circles that I run in called containment, where, for instance, you could argue that Boris Johnson was containment. He runs as the firebrand populist leader, and then he comes in and keeps things going business as usual. And I always worry about this because there is a part of me that recognizes that if you are aware of someone, if someone gets mainstream media coverage, if somebody gets their face, if they out on to the public, if they get media time to do interviews, even if they get on something like Channel 4's I'm a Celebrity, which I do believe is why Nigel Farage was on there, was essentially as a popularity run to try and build up some momentum and humanize himself for an audience. I worry, is this person truly a threat to the powers that be if they're allowing them such public-facing screen time, you could say. So in Boris Johnson, like I say, is business as usual. We had in Italy last year, we had Giorgia Meloni.
Yeah.
Are you aware of her?
Yeah.
Who came in and was being broadcast by all the media as this potentially even neo-fascist person who was going to come in. She was going to bring back Mussolini's Italy, be incredibly oppressive and repressive. She was going to exile all of the immigrants. She was going to put naval blockades against the Mediterranean Sea to stop all these boats coming across. And she comes in and doesn't enact any of that. I think she has enacted some anti-queer legislation, but her main thing that she was elected on was trying to stem the tide of illegal migration coming through Europe. And she hasn't done anything to stop that. She's in fact increased the rate of migration coming into Italy. So there's a part of me that feels very burnt. I have seen people be built up as the saviors, and I have seen them come in and do the exact opposite of what they were voted to do. And that's what containment is, the idea of containment is. There was an interesting interview from 2017 of the editor of The Spectator, which is a supposedly conservative journal in the UK, who's Fraser Nelson, said in that interview, sometimes all you need to do to get people to calm down is listen to them. You don't actually need to do anything. You just need to make them aware that we understand your concerns, we respect your concerns, they're legitimate concerns, and then you don't actually have to do anything. So I worry that some of what's being allowed to happen where you get these populist leaders be put in place and be elected in is the deep state saying, we're listening to you. We care about your concerns. They're completely legitimate concerns. And these people come in, they may have the intention to actually make some change, but then the deep state and the embedded bureaucracy turns around and says, actually, no, you can't do anything. So I worry about it, but it is definitely an expression of the frustrations that everybody feels at the moment with the system we live under.
I see the same symptoms that you do, but I think I have a slightly different sort of explanation for that phenomenon. And I think it comes down to the very last thing that you said there, where essentially the deep state, and we're talking about people that have spent their entire lives in bureaucracy. You know, let's not forget politicians get moved around very quickly. And so they'll find that they're constantly having to learn new roles, new portfolios. Every time a minister ends up under pressure, they just get shuffled into a different ministry. Well, now they're working in a different department with a whole bunch of different public servants. But those public servants have been strategically working their way up through often that very same department for 20 years before they became the head of it. And it's very much, you go back to Yes Minister, and it's the bureaucrats that really are running the government, and they can outweight a politician. They know how to slow play. They know how to frustrate. They know how to just simply keep on plodding along at their own pace with their own agenda, and sooner or later that person will be gone, thank God, and someone else will be in. And so I suspect it's not so much that these people, them getting airtime is proof that they're a controlled opposition or a form of containment or anything like that. I think it's more a case that they might be very, very sincere, and they might in their own right be getting that coverage because they're interesting, and some lead editor out there goes, hey, I can get eyeballs, I might be able to get a promotion if I do these stories and get the eyeballs, and we get the ad revenue, and then I look good to my boss. Everyone's got their own agendas going on. But the deep state, the bureaucratic state, quite simply knows how to manage these people and knows how to contain them. And this is where I find Milei particularly interesting, because the only solution, and Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, the country of Georgia, did the same thing. You go in there with a battle axe and you just cut immediately. Don't give them time. And I think that's the only strategy that really has any chance of working. And if Trump gets back in, I hope that's the strategy that he comes in with. I hope he comes back angry after what happened in 2020, and we see him take that same approach there. I think it's the only way that it could possibly work. Well, you've been very generous with your time, Harry, and I do appreciate it. I've got two more questions for you before we wind up here. Firstly, what's the next chapter for you? Where are you going? You're well established at the Lotus Eaters. People love the Lotus Eaters. They love you being a part of it. So congratulations on some great work there and becoming a part of what is really a phenomenal global success. What's next for you? Where are you going with this? As you look ahead, what are you hoping to accomplish and to achieve and to do by being a part of the Lotus Eaters and doing what you're doing?
Thank you for the compliments, first of all. I really appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say. For me, I want to work on large scale projects where I can deep dive into history because I think, as they always say, if you forget the history, you'll never. Well, if you don't know any history, then you've got nothing to ground you, and you want to. I'm making an absolute pig's arse of this.
Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think the
one.
The rest of the quote
I need to learn that phrase.
Yeah, those who do not learn their history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do learn their history are doomed to stand by helplessly watching as those who didn't learn their history repeat it. So in either case, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Well, that can be a problem, but at least I can try and do something. I want to do some larger scale historical projects looking at the history of the 20th century and some of the mass movements that were part of that, because as part of what we've been talking about, I do believe that a lot of what we know about, especially the latter half of the 20th century, are lies or obfuscations or misrepresentations of the truth of what actually happened. And so I think it's important to understand what happened really, so that we can have a better grounding of the world that we live in right now. And I want to create those projects as resources for people to be able to learn from, not just for my own intellectual exercise of being able to know more about the world and understand it better myself, but to be able to disseminate that knowledge to other people as well, because I'm doing a project at the moment where I'm trying to look back on what I'm calling the real history of gay rights, and this is going all the way back to the late 19th century. I've been looking a lot at Germany. A lot of people are aware now of Magnus Hirschfeld and his Institute of Sexology that was around in Weimar era Germany, but it goes back further than that. And it's interesting how a lot of the discussions that we're having right now over queer issues, gay issues, LGBTQ, however many letters they want to add to it now, how all of those issues have been recurring for the past 100 years and go back far further than a lot of people think. And I think looking into that can give us a better understanding of where we are right now. So that's what I'm trying to do for the moment. Those are the projects that I'm really invested in right now.
Germany is a fascinating place for so many reasons, both from a Christian Reformation point of view, but also more recently than that, the Heidelberg School and the influence that Germany has had over modern thought and postmodern thought is quite phenomenal. So I wish you all the best in that pursuit, and I'll definitely be someone who will tune in and watch whatever the result is. All right. Final question. We finally get to the heavy stuff, the deep stuff. The whole last hour has just been a warm-up. Harry Robinson, when can I get a copy of that album that you've recorded?
Well, it's all demos at the moment, and I'm working on turning them into proper, fully fleshed out songs. A few of them hit the cutting room floor now that I've been going back, but I'm hoping to at least get some kind of EP or hopefully maybe even an 8-track album out sometime next year. So I'll see how that goes. It depends on, I am a terrible vocalist and a terrible lyricist, so it depends on if I can get somebody to do all of that for me. But we'll see how it goes. Hopefully sometime next year, but no promises. Well,
next year, of course, by the time this is released in January next year, will become this year. We're recording in late 2023. But Harry Robinson, thank you so much. Congratulations on your success at the Lotus Eaters. Congratulations on your own, I guess, reformation and the growth that you've had over the last couple of years. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it takes a certain amount of humility to be able to grow, because it involves admitting that you weren't already right. And I think it's a real testament to you, the growth that you've had and now the success that you're enjoying as a result of that. So well done. Thank you so much for the generosity that you've shown us here at the Aussie Wire, going on a deep dive. I'm Topher Field. This has been a deep dive. Thank you so much for your company. Harry Robinson.
Thank you.
Well, that was a deep dive with Harry Robinson from the Lotus Eaters. I hope you had a lot of fun. I certainly really enjoyed chatting with him, and he was very, very gracious with his time. And of course, the time difference from the UK to here. He had to get up early. I had to stay up late. But you know what? It was well and truly worth it. I'm Topher Field with the Aussie Wire. If you're not familiar with the Aussie Wire, well, we have the Aussie Wire News that releases new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. We have our Deep Dive series, which is released most Sundays, at 6 p.m. It's available as a podcast as well, as are actually all of our episodes of the news. So if you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening in some other way, just keep in mind you can find us as a podcast if that's going to be more convenient for you. Check out theaussiewire.com. You can find all of our past deep dives, all of our past episodes of the Aussie Wire News, theaussiewire.com. And while you're there, make sure you join our email list, have a read of our blogs, and make sure you tell your friends as well. It's much appreciated if you help us to spread the word about the Aussie Wire. I'm Topher Field. Thank you so much for joining us on another deep dive.